My name is Maya Lundha, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this lecture by Kevin Potter in the name of the organizers of Anti-Colonial Week, of which this lecture is a part. The Anti-Colonial Week was organized by the student collective Unibeam for Palestine together with the Forum of Anti-Colonial Inquiry in the Humanities and Social Sciences. And maybe you've heard that this would have almost been on university premises, as it was an academic event, but on short notice the university cancelled their room reservations, and we are very glad that we have been able to find alternative rooms, for example here today in Gaza of Das Freie Wort, and I would like to invite you to maybe leave a donation to this room as well. They have a donation box in the back. Two more events of Anti-Colonial Week will take place here in this room today. After this, we hear a lecture by Marta Kanafānī about Gaza and global health. And in the evening, Brandon Sharon Brown will host a film screening of the film We Will Remain about a Bedouin community in Palestine. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Kevin Potter, who perhaps many of you know. He teaches at the Department of English and American Studies at the University of Vienna and is a postdoctoral researcher there. His research focuses primarily on Marxist theory, migrant literature, anarchist thought, dystopian fiction, and Palestine. For his dissertation, he was awarded the Award for Research on Migration, and the publication of his first book, Poetics of the Migrant, was released in 2023 and also received a prize, namely the Hugh J. Silverman Prize. But his research is also very wide. So, for example, this semester he also teaches a course on British satire in the 17th and 18th century. And his current research studies 19th century British literature, particularly the theological, ontological, and political anarchisms that are represented there. His most recent publication, which I can recommend very warmly to you, it's also available open access, is titled Development Through Dispossession, Ghassān Kanafānī's Return to Haifa, the World System, and Palestinian Belonging, which is also a topic related to what he will talk to us about today. We also are very grateful to Kevin for his continued support with issues around Palestine and the universities, an outspoken scholar, we don't have many of them, unfortunately, who both studies as Palestine and is very committed to his students and everyone who wants to learn about the subject. Kevin has stated numerous times that his most rewarding teaching experience was teaching in May 2024 in the University Palestine Solidarity Encampment on campus, and today we are very lucky to hear from him again. One last point regarding the room cancellations. We have drafted an open letter to the rector of the University of Vienna, Professor Schütze, where we demand basically clarification of why and how this happened, and also to meet with us and make the next Anti-Colonial Week possible. So if you would sign this open letter in support, there is a QR code that you can scan in the back, and you can read the open letter, and we would be very grateful for your support. Thanks for being here. Now, Kevin, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Yes, thank you. Everyone standing in the back, there are seats up here in the front. I don't bite, I promise. Plenty of seats to go. Okay. Good. No problem. Yeah? All right. Thanks, everyone, so much for being here. First, I really want to thank the organizers for the invitation. Very, very generous invitation for inviting me to give this lecture today. And as Maya mentioned, you could not imagine what the organizers are up against when trying to put together a series like this. Room cancellations like this, unfortunately, are quite a regular pattern at the University of Vienna, particularly when it's an event related to Palestine. And they've worked so hard to put all of this together. The Forum for Anti-Colonial Inquiry, Humanities and Social Sciences, but also the student groups Unity for Palestine. However much time you think they put into putting this together, whatever image you have in your head, they put in more work, I promise. They have worked so hard, and they did an amazing, amazing job. So, first round of applause for the organizers. I've placed my watch here. I'm going to keep an eye on the time. I don't want to tax anyone's patience more than I already have. So today, what I'd like to do is offer you a perspective on fiction, specifically the fiction of Ghassān Kanafānī. And I'm hoping this perspective can offer some insights into the global patterns of dispossession and accumulation, specifically how these patterns are indexed and represented in world literature. A proper appraisal of this system can make us better equipped at articulating our anti-colonial struggle to an internationalist struggle. So this mutually reinforcing combination of anti-colonial politics and internationalist politics, to me, seems to have been long forgotten, but when it's done properly, it puts us in the company of not only Ghassān Kanafānī, but also of Frantz Fanon and of Rosa Luxemburg. I begin with my main proposition. Palestinian fiction, specifically the fiction of Kanafānī, indexes the modern capitalist world system. I'm inheriting this insight from the Warwick Research Collective, and their theories enable us to connect literary analysis to the broader structure of capitalist imperialism without losing sight of a text's historical and cultural specificity. From here, we can negotiate between the local conditions of settler-colonialism, apartheid, and occupation in Palestine, and recognize how these systems of domination are embedded in the global life of capital, or what Marx called the international character of the capitalist regime. The tradition I'm turning to for this lecture is what we call a world systems analysis. This means that I want to uncover the logic of global capitalism that holds the world together. The world system creates a structure of unequal exchange across an international division of labor. This is a dynamic, in other words, where surplus value flows from the periphery to the core, as Emanuel Wallerstein argues. Wallerstein is the preeminent scholar of this theory. The world system, therefore, produces a relationship between development and underdevelopment that sustains the global dynamics of class rule, dispossession, and accumulation. This world system is the economic driver of imperialism. And I'll define imperialism the way that Rosa Luxemburg does, as, quote, the political expression of the accumulation of capital in its competitive struggle for what remains still open of the non-capitalist environment. That is, capitalism's need for endless expansion relies upon and deliberately exacerbates conditions of overexploitation and underdevelopment in order to both extract and realize surplus. As a result, this system has entrenched the worldwide hegemony of imperial neo-colonial domination over the global south. Palestine's modern history and struggle provides insight into the immiserating effects of the world system. John Collins writes, quote, Palestine has been and continues to be an often prophetic index of and shaper of globalizing processes, a kind of monadic unit that contains important clues to a series of much broader realities. And these broader realities he refers to are the forces of ethnic cleansing and expulsion that produce and reproduce inequalities on a global scale. If you want another really great text about this, I highly recommend Mahmoud Mamdani's book called Neither Settler Nor Native. And And if that name sounds familiar to you, yes, that is the father of newly elected mayor of New York City. So please check out his book. It has a very fantastic chapter on Palestine as well. It's the longest chapter in the book, but you'll learn quite a lot from it. The ongoing struggle against apartheid, occupation, genocide, and settler colonialism has been a persistent feature of modern Palestine. But it's not the only feature, of course. Palestinian literature also vividly represents a world of joy, solidarity, collective power, resilience, beauty, and the desire for dignity in a world beset by the cruelty of Zionism. Palestinian fiction and poetry contain the full range of humanity within Palestine and among the Palestinian people. We ignore these aspects to our peril. The turn to Kanafani was not at all arbitrary. Born in 1936 in the midst of the Arab Revolt, Kanafani lived his entire life under the punishing structure of occupation, war, and dispossession. His life spanned from the time of the British Mandate up through the firm establishment of Israel's apartheid regime until he was assassinated by Mossad in 1972. During his time at university, he took up his vocation as a writer and began documenting the memory of Palestinian displacement. Through the period of ethnic cleansing of 1948 and the consolidation of Israel's occupation in 1967, Kanafani witnessed the larger material system that sustained Israel's occupation and perpetuated the displacement of his community. This is the modern world system and the attending laws of dispossession. Kanafani also achieved his political consciousness through the socialist movement. And when asked in a 1972 interview about his own political development, he responded, quote, "There is no incident in the world that is not represented in the Palestinian tragedy. When I portray the misery of the Palestinians, I am in fact seeing Palestinians as a symbol of misery all over the world. And you can say that Palestine represents the whole world in my stories." Now this statement isn't just some kind of rhetorical flourish, and he isn't just trying to exaggerate for political effect. Kanafani admitted very openly his embrace of Marxism-Leninism during his university years. And it is this exposure that shaped his sensitivity to the dynamics of uneven development produced through the modern world system. My claim here is that we should take Kanafani at his word when he says that Palestine represents the whole world in his stories. And as such, we can see how his fiction reflects, at the level of form and at the level of content, the capitalist world system to which we are all subject. But of course, we're not all subject to it in even and equal ways. It's also important to understand that this isn't a way of flattening the world into one homologous unit, like that awful book by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat, worthy of toilet paper. Nor is this an analysis of globalization, as that stupid bourgeois cliche has it, lifts every boat up with the expansion of prosperity worldwide. That's not what I mean, and also that's not even true. What this analysis recognizes is what Frederick Jameson calls a singular modernity, that is nevertheless a system of uneven power that structures the entire planet. The uneven structure of the world system converges in Palestine in a number of important ways. Since 1948, Palestinians have been forced into permanent dependence upon surrounding labor markets, while being simultaneously subject to a regime of de-development on the one hand, especially after 1967, especially in Gaza. Sarah Roy has an excellent book about this, one of the best historians of Gaza, and extractive inequality on the other. In more recent decades, surveillance companies, weapons developers, finance speculators, and corporations around the world have long profited from the apartheid system in the West Bank and Gaza, assuring profit maximization at the expense of Palestinian autonomy. Of course, this is the entire basis of the movement for boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, so what I'm saying should not be new or surprising to anyone. The great Samir Amin argues that the globalized law of value replicates the system of unequal exchange throughout the globe. The law of value manifests, he says, in the shared interests of Zionism and imperialism. The collective imperialism, as he calls it, quote, sets out to destroy Palestine while simultaneously control the neighboring Arab countries, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, of course, Lebanon, and the Gulf countries. This regime, with the US at the helm, secures domination over natural resources, technology, oil, and communication, and monopolizes the production of multi-destructive armaments. These combined forces have intensified the dependence and peripheralization, it's a mouthful, of Palestine. The occupation, dispossession, and ethnic cleansing of Palestine, therefore, have always served the continued expansion of the capitalist world system. I'm going to quote here, actually, this is something that Kanafani wrote in 1969. As some of you know, he wrote the party platform for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in 1969. And in that, it really reads like a manifesto. I highly recommend it to you, but it has a section on world imperialism, and I'm going to quote it. It's worth quoting at length here, because this is Kanafani's own words. World imperialism has its interests which it fights fiercely to defend and keep. These interests consist in robbing the riches of the underdeveloped countries by purchasing them at the lowest prices and then processing these riches and reselling them at the highest prices in the markets of those same countries. By this operation, they accumulate immense profits, enabling them to increase their capital at the expense of the people's poverty, deprivation, and wretchedness. The Arab world possesses many resources, mainly petroleum, and constitutes a big consuming market for manufactured goods. Imperialism wants to maintain this situation to allow the process of accumulation of imperialist wealth to continue on the one hand and our poverty to increase on the other. So to take a world systems approach is to recognize how the logic of capitalist imperialism sets the terms of the global class struggle, with the world divided into core and peripheral domains. We therefore read different texts in a way that takes them beyond the sort of narrow parochial regionalisms that we're often accustomed to, talking about national literatures or authors of one nation, and recognize how they express in their own particularity the modern world system. This is a familiar gesture in Marxism, where we address the dialectical relation between the particular and the universal, enabling us to properly diagnose capitalism's laws of motion and accumulation, while keeping close contact with historical and geographical specificity. I'll now turn to the two main texts by Ghassān Kanafānī that I'll be focusing on. I'll begin with Men in the Sun. This novella, as critic Bashir Abdumane argues, fits squarely within the genre of working class fiction. And I think this is correct. Within this tradition, writers often emphasize the relationship between toil, exploitation, and alienation, especially as these experiences are tied in with broader questions of ideology, power, and identity. At the level of form and aesthetics, as Simon Lee argues, there's a, quote, emphasis on gritty, visceral representation, the unflinching use of taboo subject material, the paradox of the individual within the collective, and the personal testimony channeled as artistic and class-based insurrection. Some of you were in my working class literature class, so this is a review for you. Published in 1963, the novel represents three Palestinian men who, after their expulsion during the Nakba, must seek employment elsewhere. They begin their lives as complete strangers, separate from one another, but they come together when they arrange a deal with a smuggler to take them across the border from Iraq into Kuwait, where they hope to find work. They're smuggled in a water tank of a truck through the unfathomable, agonizing, and deadly desert heat, and ultimately they end up meeting their tragic demise by heat stroke inside of the water tank. The smuggler then dumps their stiffened corpses on a garbage heap on the other side of the border, but not before he cries out desperately, asking why. Why didn't they try to save themselves? The condition of their collective exile is something I've already alluded to. The expulsion during the 1948 Nakba left many Palestinians dependent upon surrounding labor markets, as Israel's occupation had forced Palestinians into a position of statelessness and desperation. So the combination of their forced exile within the concentration of capital within major oil-producing regions placed these three men, Abu Qayyaz, Assad, and Marwan, in a position not only refugees, but of what Marx called the Industrial Reserve Army. That is, their unemployed, stateless status leaves them both unstable and coercively expelled, forced into constant movement by capital's elastic demand for cheap labor. The opening passage provides us with an important signal to the punishing alienation of the world system. Quote, Abu Qayyaz rested on the damp ground, and the earth began to throb under him with tired heartbeats, which trembled through the grains of sand and penetrated the cells of his body. Every time he threw himself down with his chest to the ground, he sensed that throbbing, as though the heart of the earth had been pushing its difficult way towards the light from the utmost depths of hell, ever since the first time he had lain there. Now, immediately after this reflection, we hear Abu Qayyaz's neighbor mocking him, telling him that he's merely hearing the sound of his own heartbeat. But this opening passage anticipates and foreshadows the forces that lie beyond his grasp, the totality and overwhelming system that he cannot overcome. Frederick Jameson refers to this as, he refers to this as history with a capital H. History is what hurts, he says. It's that which, quote, refuses desire and sets inexorable limits to individual as well as collective praxis. This is a desperate internal feeling of some insurmountable force weighing on Abu Qayyaz's life, one which nevertheless establishes his connection to the world's workers who struggle against capitalism's totality. In a later passage, Abu Qayyaz remembers and reflects upon a teacher, Ustaz Salim, whom Abu Qayyaz remembers as a teacher who left Jaffa to teach his students in the village about, quote, where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet to form one river. Abu Qayyaz thinks of him with reverence and worry as he stands in for a type of resistance, but also a form of self-sacrifice. His long devotion to teaching is such that, quote, Ustaz had become an inseparable part of his name. The narrative then jolts us back to the present, noting that Abu Qayyaz is, quote, gliding thousands of miles and days away from his village and Ustaz Salim's school. In the very next sentence, the narrative switches to first-person point of view, and we get access to the internal monologue of Abu Qayyaz as he speaks directly to Salim in his mind. If you had lived, if you had been drowned by poverty as I have, I wonder if you would have done what I am doing now. Would you have been willing to carry all your years on your shoulders and flee across the desert to Kuwait to find a crust of bread? Now, in literary studies, when the narrative suddenly changes perspective without interruption, we call this free indirect discourse. Free indirect discourse. It's when the extra-diegetic narration, that's the omniscient narrator who sort of speaks above the characters in third person, and the intradiegetic narrative, that's the first-person I point of view, right, blend into one without a break in the paragraph. Okay? So instead of saying he thought to himself or he wondered aloud, his internal monologue just inserts itself directly into the narrative. In using this technique, and Kanafani is a smart guy, he knows what he's doing, he's calling back to the realist tradition, which we associate with authors like Gustave Flaubert, Anton Chekhov, John Steinbeck, many others. But he's adapting its form to the unique particularities of the Palestinian refugee. I mentioned to someone earlier as well that Kanafani also wrote literary criticism in addition to writing fiction. So he wrote a lot about Palestinian resistance literature. He also has a book on Zionist literature. So Abu Qayyaz is thus a subject whose worldview is built into the structure of the story, actively shaping it from his own consciousness. And so the text's point of view is his experience of nostalgia, longing, and uncertainty. This also recalls what I said earlier about the form of working class fiction, that it's the paradox of the individual within the collective. Citing Abu Mane again, he writes about Kanafani's commitment to realism in the novel. Quote, Kanafani's commitment to realism prevents him from doing more. There is neither heavenly nor earthly solace from impotent exile in the novel. God is absent and religion is seen as irrelevant. Ustaz Salim doesn't even know how to pray. Local Arab society feeds on Palestinian weakness and vulnerability rather than alleviating it, setting up obstacles for travel, work, and opportunities to live in dignity. So the choice of narrative technique and novelistic form enables Kanafani to render intelligible the harsh alienation that afflicts all three men who are seeking employment in Kuwait, where there is no respite from exile, dispossession, and poverty. Those are seemingly unavailable to them. the novel cannot give us any discernible alternative because that was not part of the reality that they can access or experience. All three men and their smuggler are from Palestine, and the unique conditions of poverty and dispossession dictate their need to make the unsafe passage to Kuwait. By the time that this novel was written, Kuwait had already become a founding member of OPEC and was experiencing a major oil boom. So the political volatility, there we go, of oil production and its status as a capital-intensive industry ensured that Kuwait could draw in cheap, desperate labor to support its growing export economy. As I said earlier, the powers of collective imperialism seek to monopolize oil and other resources, leaving Palestinians and other colonized people in a permanent state of dependence. It's a system that therefore expands and profits from an international division of labor, especially the reliability of the world's desperate refugees who can instantly fulfill labor shortages. The relationship that the three men forged with the smuggler, named Abu Ghassān, is represented throughout the text as a cold, impersonal transaction, one not based on mutual trust, common struggle, and solidarity, but one that is cynically about fulfilling one's differential interest for money. Abu Ghassān at one point speaks to the youngest of the men, Marwan, saying, quote, "I am glad you are going to Kuwait, because you will learn many things there. The first thing you will learn is money comes first, and then morals." At a later point in the text, he echoes this sentiment with the third man, Assad. When Assad asks him why he smuggles, he turns to him and states very openly, "I want more money, much more, and I find it difficult to accumulate money honestly. Do you see this miserable being, which is me? I don't want to make a single movement. I've had more than enough exhaustion in my life. Yes, indeed, more than enough." Now, in this moment, he states that he wishes to leave everything and settle down. But we as readers know that his desire to, quote, not make a single movement isn't just a desire to take rest. It also refers to his earlier life of having fought in the resistance movement, a fight that eventually left him castrated. The memory of that moment interrupts his conversations, and it dilates time when he enters the narrative. He has therefore retreated from the hopes and aspirations of a freedom fighter, choosing instead to accept the dictates of imperial power and Zionism to which he and all of the men are subject. Each of the men has to contend with both the objective and subjective conditions of loss, alienation, disappointment, and exclusion. The narrative presents the punishing desert heat as both a place-setting device, but also a device that signals how poverty and dispossession weigh down and suffocate each of them. At the story's ending, the men have been left in the water tank as the truck passes through another checkpoint. Abu Ghassān has promised the men they would only have to stay in the water tank for 7 minutes. But in a tense moment inside of the border office, Abu Ghassān is forced to stay longer, recounting a story that a fellow smuggler had completely fabricated, all for the officer's amusement. Finally able to leave, he realizes that Abu Qayyaz, Marwan, and Assad had been in the water tank for 15 minutes. Okay. After crossing the border, he climbs into the tank, and his worst fears reveal themselves in the stiff faces of the three men. They had succumbed to their deaths. Searching for a place to leave their bodies after deciding not to bury them in the desert, he says he doesn't want them to get eaten by buzzards and anything like that, so he instead leaves their bodies disposed on a pile of municipal garbage. The symbolism is staring us right in the face. The world system has rendered their lives disposable, as it does to all expelled migrant laborers. The indignity of their death and their final resting spot parallels the indignity in which they were forced to live, trapped, suffering, and eventually reduced to waste that capital can easily dispense with and ignore. The final lines of the text has Abu Ghassān wondering aloud, why didn't you knock on the sides of the tank? Why didn't you bang the signs of the tank? Why? Ending on the word why, the narrative leaves this question completely unanswered. His desperate cries and pleas are to no one but a world of echoes and shadows. The men could have knocked on the side of the tank. The bureaucrats at the border office could have heard them. They could have saved themselves, even if it meant risking arrest for all 4 of them. But they chose not to. In their final act, they don't resist, but instead, they completely surrender. The novel's position within the tradition of working-class fiction produces a unique representation of the modern world system and the particular ways in which Palestinians experienced the system in the decades following the Nakba. Kanafani wrote in his own diary at the time, quote, "The only thing we know is that tomorrow will be no better than today, and that we are waiting on the banks, yearning for a boat that will not come. We are sentenced to be separated from everything, except from our own destruction." This desperation and pessimism of Kanafani's words show up in the structure of his story, with its approach to illuminating the visceral bodily experiences of heat and exhaustion, but also of resignation. It's a condition of desperation, cruelty, cynicism, and alienation. The text's reliance on the realist narrative techniques renders thinkable the harsh, punishing structure of imperialism and its incessant need to accumulate through an international division of labor. The style is repetitive, full of rising tension and temporal disjunctions and dilations, in a story where the action is simply that of men traveling in search of work. The title of the book gives it away. They surrender to being men in the sun. It's a passive voice construction that demonstrates lives overpowered by the sun, who yield to the inescapable laws of the universe. Okay, so that's for Men in the Sun. I'm going to now move on to Kanafani's other novel, or the other novel I'll be talking about, Returning to Haifa. If you've read the article I published on this, this will sound very familiar. These next few minutes will sound very familiar to you. The story takes place immediately after the 1967 Nakba, but with continuous interrupting recollections of the 1948 Nakba. So this already makes the structure of the story comparable to Men in the Sun, in that both texts rely on these temporal disjunctions, where history and memory overwhelm and punctuate the present. But the intervening years between these two moments is actually worth spelling out for a moment. Many know the 1947-48 Nakba as the catastrophe, the formative moment in shaping the Palestinian tragedy. Yet the story's present is in the aftermath of the 1967 Nakba, which arguably opened the way for resistance movements and the mass effervescent struggle for liberation. Mainstream representations of the Nakba, of course, refer to it as the Six-Day War, or simply the Arab-Israeli War. But Palestinian writers of this period represented the Nakba as a major setback. It thwarted short-lived hopes for liberation and permanently entrenching Israel's system of occupation and military rule. At the same time, the interim period between 1948 and 1967, where the West Bank and Gaza were integrated into Jordan and Egypt, respectively, and turned into permanent refugee camps, gave rise to organized Palestinian resistance movements. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, FETA, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And this context also ushered in what Kanafani himself theorized as Palestinian resistance literature. This sets up the context for Returning to Haifa. It tells the story of Saeed and Safiya, whose expulsion from Acre to Ramallah and eventual return to Haifa 20 years later create multiple intersections of dispossession, capitalist development, psychic trauma, and national fracture. So in 1967, when the Israeli government temporarily reopens the passage from Ramallah to Haifa, the couple decides to visit their former house. In the period since the Nakba, Saeed and Safiya have had to contend with two types of dispossession. And this is what I'm going to say about the text's relationship to the world system. The first type of dispossession is their systematic expulsion from Haifa, losing claim to their home through Zionist settler-colonial conquest. The second type of dispossession is more figurative. They have to reconcile the assault on their sense of belonging detached from the signifiers that connect them to home, history, family, and identity. This cruel regime of militarized displacement and permanent dispossession shows itself notably in the story of their son, Khaldun. During a dramatic and very chaotic scene taking place during the Nakba, Saeed and Safiya leave Khaldun behind in their abandoned home in Haifa in a stroke of desperation. 20 years later, he's completely detached from both his birth parents and his own history. He not only lives with adoptive parents, assumes a name of Hebrew origin, Dov, meaning bear. He dwells in a new home, language, identity, and sense of belonging, but he's also staunchly devoted to the Zionist narrative that perpetuates colonial attitudes against Palestinians. When he meets his birth parents at the end of the text, he's dressed in military uniform, and he refers to his parents as, quote, being on the other side, reestablishing his identification with Zionism and the animosity toward Palestinians. And this, by the way, is not the impression we get from his adoptive parents. His adoptive parents don't, first of all, have that. They sort of welcome in Said and Safiya. They said, we expected you to come one day. We knew this day would come. We knew you would need to be here. We knew you needed this. And we knew also that you had no choice. Although Khaldun sees his parents as betrayers, and of course that's also how they see him, Said nevertheless tries to reconcile with his son, an offer that his son unequivocally refuses. As Said and Safiya leave Haifa again, they resign themselves to being permanently dislodged from him and from the Haifa they once knew. So, the text opens with Said and Safiya arriving at the outskirts of Haifa. The physical landscape of Haifa dramatizes the extent of the settler-colonial project. And at a certain point, Said is unable to contain his anger and his contempt toward this occupation. We read that he took control of his nerves and continued to speak to her directly. He turns to Safiya and he says, they opened the door as soon as they completed the occupation, suddenly and immediately. You know the terrible thing that happened in April 1948, so now why this? Just for our sakes alone? No. This is part of the war. They're saying to us, help yourselves. Look and see how much better we are than you. How much more developed. You should accept being our servants. You should admire us. But you've seen yourself, nothing's changed. It was in our power to have done much better than they did. Said is articulating a very major feature of colonial subjectivity, or let's say colonized subjectivity. The condescension by which they are regarded by their colonial overseers, and the assumption that they would willingly acquiesce to their status as subjugated people. As he sees it, Israel and the occupying regime are shoving their power in the face of Palestinians, projecting the fortitude of their strength and taunting the indigenous Arabs with their own dispossession. The phrase, how much more developed we are, is something I really want to zoom in on here from this slide. It's the one I put in bold there. Because it says something very instructive about the world system. The term developed, of course, has a sort of double meaning in relation to colonial power and domination, one with more of a, let's say, an economic valence, and another that connects with colonial ideology. In its economic connotation, development refers to those age-old, caretaking claims of colonial power, in which their pursuit of conquest is branded with the promise of modernization, industrialized labor, and boost in productive capacities that are necessary for state formation. But we all know better. We know that these claims are in fact cover for an active project of underdevelopment, or what the great Michael Parenti calls maldevelopment. Just to repeat the point I've made earlier, the imperial core overexploits and destabilizes the economic base of the periphery through wage suppression, debt encumbrance, tariffs, austerity, and direct expropriation. So the we, in the phrase, how much better we are than you, how much more developed, contains the corollary assumption that Palestinian territory had been underutilized and made unprofitable. But in order for imperial power to achieve this regime of settler colonialism, it also has to impose a racist colonial ideology of underdeveloped subjectivities. Built into this ideology, in other words, is an assumption about indigenous Arab peoples' lack of technical acumen and ingenuity. What Said and Safiya are witnessing as they enter Haifa is a projection of the world system and its attending laws of dispossession. The underlying system that supports the occupation is the dispossession and ethnic cleansing that Zionist forces carried out for the 2 preceding decades. The Israeli government opens the border to Haifa and shows Said and Safiya what has become of their former home, where, for example, Arabic geographical names were replaced with Hebrew names, Bridge control towers were placed with an Israeli military monument, and, quote, the smell of war was still strong enough to make the city seem dark and excited and agitated. In a very important essay that he wrote toward the end of his life, Edward Said talks about this mechanism with Zionist occupation. And he writes, these changes to landscape visibly illustrate Israel's power. They're, quote, additions to the landscape that signify aggression, not accommodation or acculturation. There are also ways in which this text indexes the modern world system at the level of form, similar to the way that Men in the Sun does. This is also a fundamentally realist text, unsentimental, matter-of-fact in its tone. At certain points in the text, we read passages with minimal punctuation, long paragraph-length, run-on sentences without a period or full stop that seem to expand endlessly. For example, there's a moment when Said and Safiya are entering their house. Said decides that his only way to enter is to rush past the entrance so that the noticeable changes to the facade don't, quote, jolt and throw them off balance. And as he's running, the narrative gives us an endless inventory of items and the memories that attend to them. The passage does so in quick, uninterrupted succession. The bell and the copper lock and the bullet holes in the wall and the electricity box and the fourth step broken in its center and the smooth carved balustrade which the palm slid over and the unyielding iron grillwork of the masativ in the first floor where Majus as-Sa'idi lived, where the door was always ajar and the children always playing in front, filling the stairway with their shouts, past all of that and onto the recently painted wooden door firmly closed. That's one sentence. Passages like this stage the accelerating process whereby capital accumulation asserts its own powers of deterritorialization, its lines of flight, and its smooth spaces, to quote Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari. Capital is subsuming borders and boundaries beneath its nomadic laws of expansion. So the style of these monster-long sentences reflects the breadth of capital's laws of accumulation, a dizzying and constantly moving process of capture and expansion without a foreseeable border or conclusion. So the language instantiates what Jameson calls a cognitive mapping of totality, in which the ever-expanding nature of colonial modernity and dispossession is apprehended at the level of style. And this is also how it has this endless cyclical recall of memories and recall of places and sensations all at once. But the way that all of these memories and impressions rush into Said's mind leads me to talk about what I would call psychic dispossession as another aspect of the text, and how he experiences the world system. During the drive from Ramallah to Haifa, Said and Safiya had to contend with the memories they try to repress, especially the guilt of abandoning Khaldun 20 years ago. Throughout their trip, they both allow themselves to confront the past, calling up memories from their time in Haifa. Quote, all along the way he talked and talked and talked. He spoke to his wife about everything, about the war and about the defeat, about the Mountain Gate demolished by bulldozers, and about the enemy who reached the river, then the canal, then the edge of Damascus in a matter of hours. His wife spoke of many other matters. Throughout the journey, neither of them stopped talking. Now as they reached the entrance to Haifa, they both fell silent. At that moment, they both realized that they had not spoken a word about the matter that had brought them there. That final sentence represents so well the effort they take to repress their memories and cope with the disconnection from their son. Oops. Okay, this one. Yeah. As readers, we eventually read about that exact moment in which Said and Safiya had no choice but to leave their son behind, knowing that returning home while the paramilitary Haganah surrounds all parts of Haifa would eventually put all three of them in danger. But the story is showing us the necessity of repression and distraction as a means of coping with grief and loss that come with exile and expulsion. Now, the meeting with Khaldun is really where we can talk about psychic and affective dispossession. Said and Safiya are sitting in their former home, where now a couple is residing under the auspices of the Jewish Agency. The items Said notices in the room are slowly absorbed into his psyche, and he describes the experience as akin to, quote, someone recovering from a long period of unconsciousness. For several minutes, Said cannot take his gaze off a set of peacock feathers in a wooden vase that stands in the center of the room. He thinks about this vase of feathers and remembers it having 7 feathers instead of the 5 remaining, and that they were originally in a glass vase instead of a wooden one. Although the reason for the missing feathers is obvious, Khaldun was playing with them as a child and he lost one of them, he can't let go what they seem to represent for his connection to his home and to his past. For Said, his fixation, or perhaps if we like psychoanalysis, we can say his sublimation, instills momentary possession over his own faculties and his sense of presence. That is, to be in possession over his emotions denotes having executive control over the intensity of them and how they show themselves. For the moment, having an item on which he can fix his gaze offers Said momentary stability and propriety. The peacock feathers are therefore the only means of possession when Said and Safiya are otherwise undergoing a loss of belonging, stability, and connectedness. When the text comes to its end, Said and Safiya's emotional instabilities are contrasted with the self-possessed manner in which Dove, or Khaldun, carries himself. Dressed in military uniform, commanding the space while he's pacing back and forth, he symbolizes the projection of power over Palestinian life in exile. After he learned 3 years prior that Miriam and Ifrat were not his biological parents, he tells them, quote, "It didn't change anything. No, nothing changed. That's certain. After all, in the final analysis, man is a cause." Now, there's a lot to say about that sentence, man is a cause. And it's been the subject of loads of reactions from critics. There's even an entire book by the title, Man is a Cause. It's a book about Kanafani's fiction. So I won't have time to go through all of those. But if I'm interested in its connection to dispossession in the world system, I'd also say it indicates being a cause means that he has the ability to set his own circumstances in motion. He's a cause, not an effect. And within a world system of unequal exchange, that statement aligns easily with someone who acts in the service of military power and class rule. The statement is therefore a declaration of power and a declaration of war. His position is as someone who does belong and feels a sense of agency and dominion. Said reveals that he recognizes the phrase man is a cause, and the implication emerges that he may have heard it from his other son, Khalid, about whom we otherwise know very little. At this moment, Said comes to realize that the demand for humanity, getting ahead of myself, that the demand for humanity that animates the Fedayeen resistance movements in which Khalid is involved might be the better source of how one can be better placed within global anti-imperial resistance. Man could be a cause, but realizes that this claim to agency is power, and power is best suited for the resistance. The story concludes, and Said and Safiya are forever among the dispossessed, in the sense of being expelled from their homes and also of being deprived of their effective relations to belonging. Nevertheless, they can accept that their life is now its own cause, invented on terms that undermine the norms of state power and nation building, but those which are built upon normativity of family and parenthood. He goes on to say we need to ask ourselves, what is a home really? What do we mean? What is a father? What does fatherhood mean? And this is how the story ends. So this is where I would like to conclude my talk for today. And thank you for your attention. Researching, teaching, reading about Palestine makes it possible for us to feel and imagine the world of global power and the broader patterns of dispossession. Furthermore, Palestinian literature, by its existence, by its presence, and by its power, can assert the existence and the invention of what Deleuze called a people who are missing. And it renders thinkable a new relationship to our world as a collective, and that is the relationship of internationalism. Materialist analysis, is the one that I've laid out here, can clarify where to intervene in the bigger structures of power through the methods of class struggle. We can see how crimes against humanity, for example, and the humanities, crime against humanity, such as the genocide Israel has inflicted upon Gaza, are not simply acts one group perpetrates against another, but are rather functions of racial capitalism and colonial modernity. That's partially why the prosecution and condemnation of those crimes occurs so inconsistently, as I'm sure you've noticed. Capitalist imperialism is the system that unites the entire planet, even if its most harmful effects aren't distributed in even and equal ways. Internationalism, as an ethics and a politics, invites us to destabilize and confront the centrality of all nation-states, as well as the fiction of national identity. In other words, we can question the ideological assumptions that reinforce states as legal and therefore natural entities. And in particular, I will always insist on the power of Palestinian literature. You can counteract the legal fiction of power projection and the bourgeois fiction of states and borders with the more imaginative and meaningful fiction from within Palestinian literature. The body of text that reflects the steadfastness, the sumud of the colonized and the dispossessed. Thank you very much for your time. Happily.
Yeah, I just really appreciated the world systems kind of analysis. I think that's something that particularly Irish people are coming to recognise a bit more now, because you're faced with the fact that there's so much support on the ground in Ireland for the government in doing anything about it in any kind of material way. And I think world systems theory is a really helpful analysis for that. And I just wondered, have you thought about the practicalities from an Austrian point of view in terms of, I don't know, here, what you're dealing with in terms of their placement in kind of world systems?
Mm. Yeah, so the question was, have I thought about the Austrian context, how it might be suitable for this kind of world systems analysis? And you point out that in the Irish context, it would very much help understand that there's a groundswell of support, but the material constraints are against you. It's a very good question. I mean, world systems analysis always takes as a starting point, as I said, the dynamics between the core and the periphery. And there's also a semi-periphery as well that negotiates as a kind of mediator between these let's say, zones, these world zones. And, in any European context, I couldn't really speak to Austria very specifically, because it's really just a matter of where the global ruling class is settled, or where the global ruling class operates from. And surely, at least within certain industries, but also within certain close connections with transnational organizations, the UN and so on, but also with atomic energy. Atomic energy is a major part of this world system, because someone has, the world police acting in support of the world being able to be sort of disciplined through the threat of nuclear power is one way that I would say is a good indicator, specifically of Vienna, and having the atomic energy center placed here. But historically, also, you have a strong relationship throughout the 20th century in Central Europe that has to kind of negotiate these contradictions within a Cold War context. And so this is always having to take seriously the battle lines between capitalist imperialism and the sort of non-aligned movements that were trying to fight against it. And Austria had a very contradictory relationship in that history. The Austrian socialists, the Austrian left particularly, had a very contradictory relationship. But in terms of today, it would suit me really to ask, to think about, again, not about one's local conditions and one's national context, but how, each state government acts in the service of bourgeois power. And how it's ultimately about having to reassert, let's say, an organized politics of internationalism that can say that, whether instead of simply fragmenting the Austrian polity as not connected to, let's say, Palestine, or not connected to the global south, is complete nonsense. And having that analysis and being forceful with that analysis would really help, I think, with a lot of people's, for example, hesitation to speak about Palestine. It's not an issue that's just over there. It is an issue that implicates those of us here, which is why a movement, however flawed you may find it to be, why a movement for boycotts and for sanctions is so important.
So in Anglophone Kanafani reception, there's a big problem that we see that divides Kanafani as a literary figure and Kanafani as like the person associated with PFLP movements.
Yeah.
And I think like Bashir Abu-Mano, who you cite, that also like falls a little bit into this problem where he struggles to locate the Marxist self-identification of Kanafani, the Marxist analysis within his literary form.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to ask you where you would locate sort of Kanafani the Marxist within his literary style.
Mm. Well, I mean, most of what I said was my attempt to try to do that. But let me say one other thing, which is that it's important to know what he saw in there's a recent text that just came out, a new collection of his work that came out last year. And they cite him, oh, there we go, yeah. So if you look in the introduction of this book, right, there's a point at which he says what his point of writing is, how he sees his role as a writer. He's not saying all writing is meant to be politically directed or that it's meant to have some kind of ideological claim. But he states it very openly about his own position as a writer, that that's where he saw his best efforts to be within the broader Marxist-Leninist movement. He was very clear about, being actively involved in writing as I mentioned, the initial PFLP platform in 1969. He drafted it, and those are his words. And it's one of the great texts of it reads like a Marxist manifesto. It's one of the great texts of Marxist history, and often not canonized among his writing. I think that's a real shame. There is also the fact that people bracket too much his nonfiction writing from his fiction writing, that they don't see that these two things are connected. So that's where, just in these two texts, I would say the Marxist analysis I'm trying to illuminate comes through the form and comes through the perspective. But it's also the case that there's an intertext between what he was writing in his fiction work and his nonfiction. And it's a real problem that we don't often read these in dialogue with each other. Yes?
Yes, I want to thank you very much for the contribution and the presentation of Ghassān Kanafānī's work, and the points you brought in, also the economic factors of the oppression of Palestine is, I think, very important in the movement for the support of its national liberation struggle. I think that I want to add to this discussion of the word system also the parts of the classes of the Palestinian revolution, which is part of this text that was mentioned. Which not only talks about the working class, of course, which is the proletariat, which is, as Marxist, essential, but also about the role of the peasantry.
That's right.
In Palestine, and which is not only the biggest class, but also the question of the struggle for land connected with the peasantry.
Right.
And the goal of these classes for political power as people democratic revolution.
Yeah.
And I think these are very important experiences that tie Palestine to Cuba, to Vietnam, to China, to the Indian and Philippine revolutions of today.
I completely
Which is
agree
very
with you.
important.
I completely agree with you, and I think actually one of the things that has created, one of the things, not the only thing, but one thing that has made it very difficult to achieve a kind of meaningful class struggle in Palestine has not been, no one has, at least very few have taken seriously the need for land reform in the same way that a lot of these peasant movements throughout the world had, and particularly because there was a systematic effort of de-development. That was, I mentioned that before, but Sarah Roy's book, where she documents the ways in which it wasn't just a matter of withholding investment, or it wasn't just a matter of suppressing wages, but it was a matter of actively going in and taking out infrastructure and destroying whatever was left of infrastructure. So it was active de-development. And having to confront those forms of de-development means having to also have a true confrontation with land reform. Before we can even begin talking about class solidarities and interclass solidarities, you have to have a really serious analysis of land reform. So I completely agree with you.
Yeah, two examples that I wanted to specify a bit more. There's the connection of Palestinian oppression to the rest of the world. One example of that would be that the NYPD is training with the IDF.
That's right.
Explicitly. So, and Palestine, and especially Gaza, is very much a testing ground for like crowd control, crowd control measures, and what to, and like almost a Nazi-esque way of trying things out on how to keep people down, basically.
Sure.
And another thing, how the whole Palestinian conflict relates to Austria is that our former Chancellor, Sebastian Kurz, is very much tied in with Pegasus, which is tied in with Palantir and Pilotino, and is basically an Israeli asset now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that they want to, and again, these interconnections have a very deep history as well, right? The 1936 revolt, as many of you know, when Palestine was a British mandate at the time, they recruited veterans from the Black and Tans group who would put down the Irish Revolt of 1918? 1918, is that right? Year? 1960, thank you. They recruited veterans from the Black and Tans to put down the Arab Revolt, knowing full well that this is a similar colonial, the same colonial efforts. We are learning from the past of colonial techniques, borrowing from one another, learning from how to extend. Jabotinsky was very open about what inspiration he derived from Andrew Jackson during the Trail of Tears, for example. And one thing to also say, I mean, in terms of, the connection between, it's not just the NYPD, it's police all throughout the US. What happens is IDF soldiers fly to police stations and train them on different, not just crowd control techniques, but also Krav Maga, for example. That's the technique that killed George Floyd, and that the officer used to kill him. But also things like the kettle and corral technique, where you back people into a corner, they start fighting each other, and then you recruit them. That's called a kettle and corral. That's taken directly from the IDF. Things like this. They're all deeply connected, and they have a very long history in colonial modernity and imperialism.
Is there another question?
I guess it's a follow-up question, because you used the term of the Industrial Reserve Army.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you if you want to sort of explain that a little more, as opposed to like why you think that is the fitting concept, as opposed to like the surplus population. I'm thinking of like recent pieces, for example, by Nadia Boali and Ray Gracier, that tried to like explain the expelled working population of Palestine as an absolute surplus population.
Yeah.
So and this is like I think fair to recognize as a trend within like recent decolonial Marxist theories. Is like this concept of identifying the population with respect to annihilation, and also in relationship to like the integration of a certain workforce into the Zionist economy. So yeah, if you want to elaborate a little bit more on like
Sure.
what that entails.
I mean, so the question was about the concept of surplus population as opposed to the concept of industrial reserve army. I mean, it's great because indeed, you know, there's actually a really wonderful essay by the late great Patrick Wolf. It's co-authored, he wrote with David Lloyd, on the interconnection between settler colonialism and neoliberalism. And he says the thing that connects settler colonialism and neoliberalism is that both of them are founded upon the logic of managing a surplus population. You have to maintain a surplus population. That is how you maintain the hegemony of the central class unit that governs and has domain. But in the case of the text that I analyzed, the industrial reserve army is a more meaningful concept only insofar as it means that you can call upon that reserve army to fulfill a labor shortage at the last second. And that's how the characters operate within the text. So they're both a surplus population insofar as they are thrown from the sort of access to the imperial core or thrown from the access to the industrial base. But they're an industrial reserve army because they're called upon at the last second to fulfill labor shortages. Much like every sort of guest worker program that this country had and UK had and the United States had after the Second World War. So that's where I think the concept differs, but it has this overlap insofar as the way that you maintain the position of the ruling class is through this constant replication of a surplus population. Yeah, I don't see them as opposed to each other. Let's put it that way. I don't see there any real tension between them, only except for the pull factor that brings in the industrial reserve army.
You were talking about the developed and underdeveloped,
Mm-hmm.
and how the one tells the other, yeah, you have to subjugate yourself,
Yeah.
because you should accept you being our servant, because you should admire us, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree it's a very useful theory to see how the world also works,
Mm-hmm.
the world's
System.
world
Yeah.
system.
Yeah.
But I asked myself, what is the developed and underdeveloped? Where would you draw the line? Of course, it's a theory, so it's
Yeah.
not, this is the developed and not developed. Where do you draw the line? Because even in the developed societies, do we just understand the states, the developed states?
That's a good question.
Because we know also in the global north,
Mm-hmm.
we are slowly also dispossessed.
Yeah.
We are also slowly dispossessed by the capitalists and having less and less access to public housing and to what we constructed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So where would you draw this line?
It's a very good question. I mean, you sort of anticipate my answer because really, we're not just talking about there's only underdeveloped and there's only developed world, right? Because even within a city, you have dynamics of development and underdevelopment. Right? You only have to go from one side of Vienna to the other to notice the dynamics of underdevelopment and development within this city. Right? There's also development and underdevelopment within different employment contracts. Everyone understands that when you work at a different job, you have a higher wage. When you have a higher position, you have a lower wage. Those are also forms of underdevelopment. We don't typically talk about them on those terms. But surely the forces of gentrification, the forces in which a company moves because they know that they can attract more wealthy residents because they can attract more people to buy their stuff, where you put all the luxury stores. Those are also the ones that have all the clean streets. Those are the ones that have all of the nice pavement, and they collect trash very, very consistently. And then the other parts, the more impoverished parts of the city, are the ones where there's less tax revenues. So there's no reason to provide anything for them. There's less any way in which they can have, but there are also the places that are more policed, right? So the way you have to construct this is to also recognize where the concentration of surplus and the concentration of power and the concentration of class power goes, and where the deprivations of class power are, and they're changing with every locale, and they change from decade to decade. I almost pointed to my students to be if you wanted to answer that question, because we talked about this in class. I can see you all getting nervous.
There's a first question, then you can do the second.
I'm interested in these novellas
bang on the tanker, these moments that maybe don't fall neatly into the category of like resistance, resistance literature, and it makes me think about kind of this idea of like resistance literature, capital R, capital L, as like kind of a normative force in its own right, or kind of almost an oppressive category in its own right. And I was wondering if there are ties between Kanafani's fiction and his literary criticism that address, like, does he have ideas in his literary criticism about how maybe this kind of like idea that all literature, especially written by Palestinians, should be resistance? Or just if you have thoughts.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I would first of all completely agree with you that there's nothing in this text, and I certainly wouldn't think that Kanafani would believe that Men in the Sun even offers anything in the way of a resistance literature. He himself wrote books about resistance literature, but this text itself is very pessimistic. It's a very realist text. It's not offering us anything in the way of trying to present a mode for sort of what say you would call a counter-articulation. Only insofar as it gives us access to the forms of class and gives us access to what oppression is, makes it visible. Insofar as that, it might offer us something as a tool or as a mode of analysis. But I wouldn't call it resistance literature at all. In terms of what every literature is meant to be, or there are literatures out there. I mean, Darwish is probably the example I would turn to for resistance literature. Absolutely. In terms of what he had to say about kind of enlarging yourself and thinking beyond the apparatchiks and bureaucrats in power. That to me seems to speak a lot more in the service of resistance. And Kanafani was a big outspoken promoter of Darwish's work. In the generations that followed, writers who were writing in English wrote a lot about sort of taking analysis of different, sort of what does count to me as resistance literature is also resisting the Zionist narrative. And if you can do that, if you are presenting the full range of Palestinian humanity, if you're presenting the full range of what Palestinians are rather than how Zionists treat them, then you are on the way to offering a kind of counter-narrative that does better and acts more, has more political impact. Yeah.
So, in the back, and then you.
Yes, I think the discussion is very important about the question, where is the schism, where is the breaking point of the imperialist countries and the oppressed. Like, it came up a lot. And I think in Austria, for example, we can see there are some characteristics of underdevelopment and periphery. Like, for example, Austrian industry is to a large scale industry which delivers only to the German industry. But I think to not see it only as a spectrum, but to make a definition, very important to separate the accumulation also from the concentration of capital. Because in an imperialist country, there is capitalist monopolies. And an oppressed country, there are not. And therefore, in an imperialist country, the main export is capital and industrial goods. In an oppressed country, it's not often these industrial goods are a means to subordinate these countries and to also to extract the resources from this country, which is the main export, for example, from Kuwait. It's not capital, it's oil. So, in this sense, Austria is an imperialist country.
Yeah, thanks for that.
I very much agree with your previous point that just showing Palestinian humanity in its full extent can be a resistance in and of itself, and I think this very much reminds me of like essentially you're aware of the Instagram series of a woman called Ghassan in Gaza, who filmed herself every day and was just like, my name is Ghassan, I'm alive, and filming her surroundings, her family, preparing food, etc. And Al Jazeera then turned this into a documentary and handed it into, I think, for like a Golden Globe or something, and that caused a massive backlash because a lot of the Zionists in America did not enjoy just raw iPhone footage of Palestine.
I don't have a response.
Do you want to respond?
I don't have a response.
Let's take then another.
I just have a quick reaction to one of the previous questions about like this dichotomy between like developed versus underdeveloped and so on. I think we need to complexify this a little bit more because those concepts are also interpenetrated. There's an internal colonialism to the U.S. that, for example, Hugh Newton talked about in his theory of intercommunalism. I'm thinking of Sam Klug's work. I'm thinking of Mamdani's work, not the mayor, his father.
Yeah.
So just that there's moments, in any Maoist account, like there's the Comrade de Bourgeoisie, so like there's moments of exploitation, of national exploitation in settler-colonial societies, as well as there's moments of like hyper-exploitation of other communities within the developed countries. So it's just it's not this clear dichotomy. And I wanted to sort of push back against your affirmation that Man in the Sun is a pessimistic piece of work, because that's precisely how many liberals misread this "why didn't you knock on the sides of the tank?" It's like this: why didn't the Palestinians just make themselves heard? And Kanafani actually said himself that this moment in his novella was him saying that people, like it was a call to arms. He called it a call to violence. He said himself like this was his moment of himself knocking. I think there's also other moments in the collection, like the Saad story, where she at first she's like, oh, I'm worried about my son joining the Fedayeen, and then in the end she says, if he joins the Fedayeen, then give him a gun. Like if he wants to shoot somebody, let him shoot somebody, and so on. I think.
But then they die. I mean, they die suffocating, right?
No, I'm talking about the Saad story,
yeah.
but yes, of course they die suffocating. But the point is that Palestinians never cease to resist, and this is.
I see what you're saying.
This is one moment, and also like in the end, like he doesn't lay them to rest on a garbage pile because he thinks that their life is worthless.
But he says he doesn't want them to be eaten by buzzards in the desert.
Yes, because he wants the authorities to find them and give them a proper burial, so that their death is not anonymous.
Yeah.
So I think there's, I think it's a very, There are moments that read as defeatist, but I think in like situating Man in the Sun, the novella aside the other stories that Kanafani wrote at the time, and like the books he wrote at the same time, like on Zionist literature, for example, I think it does count as resistance literature, and he does through his own style make like a multitude of assertions within the text that the only way forward is through resistance. I think you pointed it out yourself in like the end of Return to Haifa. I think these moments of identifying with the resistance movement of Fedayeen, I think this is persistent throughout all of his works actually.
Yeah, but there was a huge gap between the writing in his early 1960s and the writing in the late 60s. There was a huge change in how he saw the relationship between what his literature could reflect then and what it could reflect after 1967, right? Because there was a difference in how, I mean, I quoted his own diary, right? In his own diary he says, we didn't have any hope for anything. The only one we had, the only hope we had was that we would exist. But that meant to him, right, again, these men are succumbing to their death. We could say that maybe someone asking why they didn't, another Palestinian man saying, why didn't you try to save yourselves? He's trying to do something for them. But the question still remains as to why they didn't try to do something.
I think I would answer with like, that Kanafani is presenting a sort of Adornian gesture that like the absence of hope is precisely where the moment of courage starts. I think you need to, in like, especially in the realist tradition, you need to first assert that there's no other way in order to present to the reader that like the horizon is, the horizon needs to be crossed.
Is that something we find in the realist tradition?
I think in the realist tradition that Kanafani was certainly referencing, which was the realist tradition of the soul.